One of the teenagers, Jessie Misskelley, borderline mentally disabled with a documented low IQ, confessed after 4 hours of police interrogation, implicating his friends. He would later recant, but the town was already convinced the 3 devil-worshipping kids were guilty.
Okay. Well, you came back a little bit later, and all 3 boys are tied. Is that right?
Yeah, I took off and went home.
All right. Have they got their clothes on when you saw them tied?
They had them off.
They had already gotten them off. When he first hit the boy, when Damien first hit the first boy, did they have their clothes on then?
Mm-hmm.
All right. When did they take their clothes off?
Right after they beat up all 3 of them and beat them up real bad.
Hello everyone and welcome to Real Crime Profile. I'm Laura Richards, advocate, analyst, author and founder and director of Paladin National Stalking Advocacy Service. And with me today is
Lisa Zambetti. I am the casting director for Criminal Minds, and I have a real interest in real crime and the minds that solve those crimes. And we're missing somebody.
We are today, sadly, and we're in different time zones. Right. So for our listeners to know, I'm Skyping in from London. I landed here last week. And I have been trying to deal with my jet lag and all the work that I'm doing, as well as some of you would have heard about the terrible fire that we had in Grenfell Towers and also
the bus crash. Park. Oh my gosh.
We had a terror attack as well last night. So there's been a lot going on in the capital city, along with a heat wave. So everything is scorchio, literally. And we're missing Jim. We're Skyping together. You're in LA, which I hear is also very hot at the moment, and we're missing our third very important wheel.
Right. So not only are we in different time zones, but Jim and I have started back at Criminal Minds, and he's in the writing room right now and can't join us right now. So after I talk with Laura, I'm going to race across Los Angeles and go to the XG studios in Culver City, where I'm going to meet with Jim and we're going to resume this conversation. So it's the way that we could make it happen. And we so want to talk about this case that we don't want to let another week go by. So this is the way we're dealing with it.
And it's real life. I mean, as our loyal listeners will know, and those who are at CrimeCon, you all know that I'd flown in from Yosemite to then get to Indiana and LA, and we obviously dropped our live CrimeCon, our very first one, last week, and we were so determined to make the West Memphis case happen because so many of you have asked for it. So we really don't want to let you down, but we also want to do justice to this case as well. So there's quite a lot of research that goes into these cases, and people have asked what sorts of things are we reading. So it's probably worth just mentioning that we have talked about some books, but there are many others on this very subject. And we've also been looking at the callahan.mysite.com. That's got a lot of the material, hasn't it, Lisa? Lots of the...
It's an incredible website, and it just speaks to how this case has really hit people, that somebody would take the time. This is not a government website or anything. This is two people who have gone to the trouble of finding all of this original primary source material. They have the original case files, handwritten case files that they have taken the time to scan in. They've, of course, got all of the testimony from the trials, the transcripts from the trials. They've got photographs. They've got everything. And the great thing about the Callahan site is there is absolutely no commentary about the material. It's just the source material that you can read for yourself. There's no commentary along with it to try to sway your opinion one way or the other. It's just these are the facts as we know them. So that's a really great website, although it will take you hours and hours to get through because there's just so many, there's thousands of documents to look through. So I've spent many hours just getting bleary-eyed reading through statements, as I know many of our listeners have.
Absolutely. And, just to reiterate what Lisa's saying, there's over 15,000 files, which is transcripts, images, interviews, and it's put together by Greg and Monty. And actually, Greg is a supporter of the West Memphis Three, but Monty's not. And they're two lay people. And as Lisa said, although they may come from different perspectives, there is absolutely no commentary on it at all. And it really is close to the complete trial transcripts as you can get. So it really is a bibliothèque that's worth dipping in and out of. And they also very helpfully list a lot of the books that are available on this subject too, from the 2002 published Devil's Knot, which is the true story of the Memphis Three by Mara Leverett, to also John Douglas's account. In fact, he's written a number of different collections on this, but one of them was written in 2013 called Law and Disorder, the legendary FBI profiler's relentless pursuit of justice, which John wrote with Mark Olshaker. So there's lots of other material, but we will sort of reference different things as we go along. And I know certainly where we left off, if we cast our minds back, we started talking about Jessie Misskelley, because the documentary Paradise Lost launches into the suspects very early on, and we decided not to do that. But we do now need to visit each of those key defendants who were then found guilty. And then, of course, as we know, 18 years later, that they enter an Alford plea, which means that they're not technically exonerated, which has also led to two very divided camps of those who believe that they are still guilty and, of course, those who believe that they're not.
Yeah, there's been these camps all along, and I have to tell you, for the life of me, I cannot keep them straight. You're either a non or you're a truther. And I don't know which, I can never tell which is which. And I think I'm a non-truther or a true nonner. I don't know what I am. I'm still right in the middle of it. But yeah, there are these two definite camps that believe that they are guilty and will always be guilty. And there is another camp who have championed their innocence for decades and are very happy that these three defendants are free. And it's funny, Laura, because as we get closer to talking about these three teenage boys, I get very nervous because, you know, the more you talk about them, the less we envision the victims in our minds, because these three teens really became larger than life characters. And especially one of them had an entire cult of personality around him. And so, you know, we're going to be talking about them, but some of it is such a distraction for me from the actual crime. The things that we're going to talk about to me are just, you know, it's a shame. Not that they may or may not be guilty, but that the things that people thought that made them guilty, I do feel were inaccurate. But anyway, so we're going to start off with these confessions that were given by Jessie Misskelley.
Now, I'm going to stay true to the process in that I am still going through an awful lot of the material. And so Jim and I started with understanding the crime scene and the crime scene analysis, the assessment, understanding behavior. And what we do tend to do is compare, as you do, you compare cases. And that tends to be a mental process, first of all, of things that you've seen and heard about before. And then other things that, you know, perhaps you haven't, but you cannot help but draw from your experiential learning about other cases. And of course, there's still a lot of reading to do. And this is such an extensive case with so much material. And I think that online, you have to be very careful what material you're looking at.
Absolutely.
Of course. And we're looking across those documentaries, Paradise Lost, starting with that. And, you know, that is our kind of arc across to have the discussion, just so that our listeners can watch something and use the reference material as well. But of course, we're bringing to bear our experience. And it's not always easy to catalogue when you're talking every case that you are bringing to bear that sits behind your hypothesis, or maybe that something that becomes your theory. But certainly, you know, my expertise is not in false confessions or coerced confessions, but I have been exposed to many. And in terms of also revisiting London and clearing out various files, I also came across my master's, which was in forensic and legal psychology. And I actually revisited a cold case in my master's psychology degree, where I profiled the profilers profiling a case.
What? Wait a minute.
Exactly. Profiling the profilers. I wanted to understand the process, even though I was working in the field at New Scotland Yard, and it was a cold case of a young boy, because this case happened in 1967. And it was on the 6th of May that a young boy called Keith Lyon who was 12 years old at the time, was stabbed to death in an area outside of London, in Brighton, Sussex. And I felt that it would be a good use of time to do my master's in an operational context and revive an old case that was no longer active. And, what was very interesting, well, there were a number of things with this particular piece of work, because it shows the challenges between an operational context and when you're trying to bring controlled conditions into an area and environment like this, the two things can conflict. But I did assess and analyse 4 different profilers in the UK who I have great respect for, who all came to, interestingly, the same conclusion independently, but they had different processes. And those processes were things like, some were very statistically oriented, because we had a database called Catchem, which was a child murder database. And so one of our profilers was a police officer who used that database. Others used statistics on their own, and another came from a clinical background that was much more an inductive process. And then the profiler used a hybrid of all of those processes. And it was very interesting because they came to the same conclusion, but in terms of the actual scene itself, Keith was in similar age to these 3 boys. And remember, well, a number of years apart, as in 4 years apart, but they were still young, prepubescent boys, which, are rare cases in and of themselves, thank goodness. But they were... Obviously, the 3 boys, Stevie, Christopher and Michael, were found without their clothes on and in a very secluded and isolated area, and they had been hidden. Or an attempt had been made to conceal them. Whereas Keith's attacker had left his clothes in situ, although his clothes had been interfered with, but he was found in an area that was remote in the sense it was a cut through from his home address to the shops, but he hadn't been hidden in any way. And in fact, someone came across him and he was laid out in full sight, and he had been stabbed multiple times with a knife that was then found not too far from the scene. Suffice to say, that case, actually, from doing that piece of work, and, I take my hat off, or doff my hat to the profilers who were involved, because they actually managed to solve this case. And although some of the exhibits had been lost, it was clear who Sussex Police should have been looking at. And I think it was a worthwhile process, just showing how you can do something that is a master's dissertation, but actually has real life practical application. So that was in my memory bank at the time. And, I think with that particular case and others that I've looked at, you do tend to see, and of course some of them are historic, but forensic evidence at the scene. Particularly the younger the perpetrator, the more likely it is that you are going to see forensics and physical evidence and exploratory behaviour on the victim and at the scene. And that's obviously something that appears to be absent, because profiling isn't just looking at things that are similar. When you're looking across cases, I actually look for things that are absent as well, and things that are missing, and the things that are absent can be far more revealing and telling about the perpetrator or perpetrators who committed the crime.
Right. Well, you just blew my mind in a lot of different ways. I didn't realize that this seems so like a dumb question, but that profilers would have different ways of coming to a conclusion. You just sort of think if you're a profiler, there's like one blueprint or one syllabus or one, step-by-step thing that as a profile you do, but you're saying that there are a variety of ways to examine something.
There is no one recipe to follow in order to profile, but there is training and there are certain processes that you go through. But somebody's experience of working cases and working in the police is second to none, or having a specialism. It's really important because you do draw a lot on other types of cases, and you get those profilers who I've certainly worked with many who are brilliant at what they do, and I've also worked with some who are not. So just because you might have one research paper that says that profiling, because the actual how you analyze it and assess it and how you review it to say whether it works or not is quite complicated and complex as well. It's not simple. So it depends who you're profiling, what they're doing, are they working in an operational context, what their background is, and how you document. And of course, the real proof that's in the pudding is once a profile has been completed, and it's not just a case of, an off-the-shelf profile, it's how useful it is to a practical investigation. What are the things that are actionable? Is then comparing it, hopefully when you prioritize, because a profile should help you look at pools of individuals, which pools to fish in to try and find the perpetrator or perpetrators in the quickest time possible. But the real proof comes from when you've identified that person and forensics and a number of things corroborate that this is the right person, and then you can review it and look back to see accuracy levels in terms of what the profile was saying.
So as you mentioned, the different profilers, it being different skill levels, there is, apropos to this case we're talking about, the West Memphis 3, there is another profiler who came into the picture, or I should say, there is a profiler who came into the picture, Brent Turvey. And is he somebody that you've worked with, or or do you want to talk about that or not? You're smiling.
Mr. Jim Clemente will probably say much more on the subject. I mean, from my perspective, I came across, and I think Brent actually sent me his book some time ago, which is sat in my office, which was a book that was written on criminal profiling. And when I went to work in the FBI for the number of months that I was very fortunate to work in the behavioral analysis units, when I mentioned that I had received this book, I was informed by the profilers there that Brent actually wasn't what they would call an accredited profiler, really? And that he had written a book, a manual, but yet he wasn't experienced in terms of their processes, or accredited by the FBI, or deemed to be a profiler in America. And I know Jim has his view on that. So, I think there are lots of people who do call themselves profilers and, have carved out a niche perhaps for themselves, or written on the subject. And what I will say about Brent is that the one thing I do know is that at that time, he was the only person who had produced sort of a book or a manual. And I know that, in essence, it spurred those on who were working operationally in the field and who had a lot of experience in the field to then create various training packages and manuals and books and so on and so forth. So that is a valid contribution in and of itself. But of course, he does appear in this particular case that we're talking about.
So he appears in actually the second documentary, The Paradise Lost, Part 2. And he appears with Dan Stidham, who is Jessie Misskelley's lawyer. And Jessie is somebody we're going to be talking about in a second. And he does provide an alternative narrative for the injuries that are found in the autopsies. And so, we're going to get into that. Oh, God, this just opened a whole can of worms, but that's okay. I know some of our listeners are like, wow, they're swinging really wide. Like, when are they getting back to the case? But I think it's really important what Laura is saying, that when she and Jim look at this case, they are not coming to it from, a layperson's point of view. They're not coming at it from an emotional point of view, or if they like or dislike the people that they're seeing in the documentary, just based on their gut impulses, which I completely am. That is my job, to be completely emotional and go with my gut with absolutely no training. Laura's going to mention another case I know that came up recently, that these cases that are similar to what happened to Chris, Stevie, and Michael, they're important that she reference as she's looking as how to create her profile in this case, and as we go over the evidence together. So thank you for taking us on that journey, Laura. And I know we're gonna arc it back to what we're talking about at hand, but it's important that's why we do this podcast, to do these very deep dives and really talk about things in a context and not in a soundbite. So I'm really glad she's taking me through this part of it to really educate me on what has happened in the history of these kind of crimes.
Absolutely. And some of it, as our listeners know, we're not scripted. So we don't sit there and talk about certain beats. There are things that just happen. Yeah. For example, me just finding my master's dissertation. And that was one of the first pieces of work that was written in this country about assessing. I mean, it was actually called an assessment of, my actual title was an assessment of the processes involved in compiling a behavioural profile for an unknown offender. And you didn't know that I was going to mention that. But for me, that was a key part of my learning and part of my expertise in understanding that things are not perfect, But actually, I do always like to do things that have a practical, real-life application. And profilers do have different backgrounds, and it's like anything in life. Your different experiences really help give different opinions at times. And it's not about people sitting around a table and all having the same opinion when you're profiling cases. Actually, you invite people to have different opinions because you get to a far better product. And that's one of the things.
That's like a classic scientific, the scientific method is to test and retest your thesis.
It is.
Yeah.
And that's what we saw on the case of JonBenet Ramsey. That's what we wanted to do, is that we had multiple hypotheses and you test them before they become theories. So the people challenging you from different perspectives, that's not a problem. Of course, it's how you challenge. But what I really liked about when I worked in the FBI for the time that I was there was that when we did case consults, we all had the same information about a case. But then when we were doing a case consult, every profiler came at it with a different, it was a horseshoe table. And we would debate it. We would debate why someone thought one thing rather than another. And we'd bring the senior investigating officers in and we would debate it with them. They would then get the sum of all of that accumulative experience. They could make the decision about what they thought. And, the journey of offender profiling or criminal behavioral analysis and profiling, is still an ongoing one. But I do have a lot of respect for people who are behavioral analysts. And of course, we have those who are forensic scientists. We have facial profilers, geographic profilers. The field has exploded. And absolutely, behavioral profiling and behavioral analysts have the work that they do has solved crime. But that's not always what is in the newspapers or written in books. A lot of people who do this work behind the scenes. They're not the ones at the forefront of the media. They're busy doing the job. And they're not doing it for the accolades. And they're also very circumspect, as I always am, about you don't want to educate the perpetrators.
Right.
So, there's a real balance to be had. It's not just one-dimensional about the crime scene and who did it. They also help with media strategy, interview strategy, a priority criteria, of where to find, what kind of pools to fish in to find these types of people. There's a lot more to profiling than just one-dimensional aspect to it.
Hello, it's Jim Clemente and Francie Hakes with a special message about a new show that I'm hosting on Wondery called Locked Up Abroad. In each episode, people tell their harrowing stories of being convicted of crimes and jailed in foreign lands, or kidnapped and held hostage in war-torn countries.
These are definitely worst-case scenarios. They're truly frightening situations.
Yes, no best cases here.
But it is fascinating to hear how they manage to survive these ordeals.
In the first episode, Midnight Express, Billy Hayes tells us about being imprisoned in Turkey for smuggling hashish. Oliver Stone even made a movie about it. But that was the movie. This is the real story. I even had the chance to interview Billy Hayes recently, and he told me the whole story behind the story of how he escaped a Turkish prison. He even told me that he went back to Turkey years later. You have to hear his story to believe it.
And now, in his own words, here is Billy Hayes.
Police on Merseyside say that 2-year-old James Bulger, who disappeared from a shopping precinct at the weekend, was horribly murdered and then dumped on a railway line. They say that someone must know the identity of the 2 boys who took James from the precinct.
The case I wanted to give a nod to again when we're talking about the West Memphis 3 of Michael, Stevie and Christopher is the case, and many people will remember it, of Jamie Bulger, who on February the 12th in 1993 was reported missing. And the reason why I wanted to mention this case again was just to say that in terms of what we then understood had happened, well, firstly, it was captured on CCTV, one of the boys leading him away. Now, Jamie was 2 years old at the time, and he was abducted from a shopping mall, which again is a very rare thing. When we go back to 1993, the West Memphis case happened in May 1993, but there is a read across, as we mentioned last time. But little Jamie, when he was found, and he was not concealed, but he had been hit by a train and he had been severed in 2 because he was actually led to a train track. And that's where he was tortured. And along the way, there were people who saw these 2 boys with Jamie in various states of distress, with one with a big bump on his head, one eyewitness said, and that he was crying and looked like he was being taken, and not very happy about it. And the two boys were challenged, and they just made out that he was the brother. So the sequence of events, the footsteps of Jamie were seen by other people. They weren't trying to hide the fact they were walking along with him. But he had 10 skull fractures and 42 injuries, and it was impossible for the pathologist to say which injury was the fatal injury. And you can read about the case online, but I did just want to underline that he had batteries placed in his mouth. They were believed that the batteries were also placed in his anus, and his clothes had been removed, and he had a 22-pound iron bar dropped on top of him.
Oh, God.
Which is just every mother's worst nightmare and so distressing. I'm sorry, Lisa.
Okay.
I just
No, it's okay. I'm so
wanted
sorry.
to highlight to people the
my
types of cases. And they're so distressing. And you're right to feel that way, because when people read about these cases in textbooks or online, what they don't always understand is the horrific nature of what that entails and what that means. And people form opinions without truly understanding what has gone on, and certainly what profilers, detectives, police professionals and others are exposed to.
Right, yeah.
What families suffer and what they endure. And it's incredibly tough work for all those professionals, and it's the worst thing that can happen to a parent.
Yeah.
And for the Bulgers, for Denise to have to sit through what happened, understanding what happened to her son and the father, I just cannot even imagine. But this kind of event, thank goodness, this kind of crime is incredibly rare too. When they do happen, you do compare them across,
right,
whether it's across the UK or across the US. And this case had a lot of international news headlines because people deemed whoever it was to be so evil. And of course, it turned out to be two 10-year-old boys.
Right.
Two 10-year-old boys who were put on trial for murder, because that is the criminal age of responsibility. And in fact, they were 11 when they stood trial. But it's important to understand the crime scene in that it was very criminally unsophisticated, as in there was no countermeasures taken. There were forensics tests undertaken, which showed clearly that there was blue paint found on Jamie Bulger that matched blue paint found on these two boys, that there was blood also found on the boys' clothing as well as on Jamie Bulger that matched, as well as, and some of these things are, really talk to the brutality, the torture, but there was also paint marks on the toe cap of Venables' shoe. He was one of the perpetrators, which showed the force at which he was kicking this little boy. So there was a lot of physical evidence and trace evidence, and there was also CCTV images charting their footsteps as well as people seeing them. So the case was, absolutely shocking to everyone in Britain, without a shadow of a doubt. But there was clear forensic evidence. It was obvious. In a sense, they had the footsteps of the boys leading Jamie Bulger away, and a lot of forensic evidence that put the two boys at the scene, even though they denied that they had killed him. But there was a lot of exploratory behaviour, a lot of torture, and that's really what you would expect to see if you're looking at young teenagers, and, in particular, prepubescent boys, which obviously the three boys were, as was Jamie.
So I do remember this case. It was an absolutely shocking and horrible case. And there, as you say, there are many, many pictures that were disseminated nationally of them leading him away. I mean, there was no question at all. You could literally see the footsteps of these two perpetrators and the little boy. So it's not like in this case how Christopher, Michael, and Stevie just kind of vanished into thin air. And, there are so many questions about how they got to where they were and who was around. I mean, in Jamie Bulger's case, you can, as you say, people saw them, people stopped them. These are eyewitnesses that were incredibly credible. And Jamie's case actually fits into the West Memphis 3 documentaries in this way. And we haven't really talked about the genesis of the documentaries, but this case, Jamie's case, came to the attention of Sheila Nevins, who is the godmother of documentaries and has been at HBO for a really long time. And so she was aware of this case, and when she read in the back pages of the New York Times this account in West Memphis, Arkansas, of these 3 teens who had been arrested for a satanic ritual murder, all of this feels like the world is coming undone, that children are killing children, and why are they doing this? And so that's why she commissioned Sinoski and Berlinger to go out to West Memphis and find out why these 3 teens committed this crime. So they went out there with the intention of, with the forethought that these teens were guilty, and they approached this documentary from that way. And I think that's really an important distinction, that they were not there from the beginning of the crime. They arrived there when the teens, were already arrested and embedded themselves with the victims' families. They were only shooting the victims' families and embedding themselves with law enforcement to try to get the story and try to represent, the victim's point of view. And in fact, became more convinced that the teens were guilty, after being with these families who were in incredible pain, and after listening to law enforcement. And it was, only much later when they started interviewing the defendants that they started to feel like there were things that weren't making sense. But anyway, Jamie Bulger's case certainly was fueling the fire that led to this documentary.
And you just said it, one key thing there about, the context was children killing children, that, they went there because they wanted to try and understand, is this something, a new kind of phenomenon, what's going on with children killing children? And what was interesting about some of the eyewitnesses is that when they saw Jamie walking along with these 2 boys, in their minds, there was no way that they would mean this little boy any harm, because they were so young themselves. Sure. And my goodness, they must live with that guilt. Why didn't they say something, or why didn't they do something? But of course, you don't expect 2 10-year-old boys to be abducting a little 2-year-old toddler. No, and I think that context, is important, particularly when we understand that the younger the victim, and we discussed this before, the more likely it is to be someone that's known. The younger the victim. So, we know that people who are around a toddler or a younger, a baby, etc., tend to be the carers and people that are around them immediately. Others don't have access to them, and that's the reason why. So, people just assume that these were the brothers, or, that Jamie was in their care. And of course, with Stevie, Michael, and Christopher, they may well have got themselves from A to B, i.e., the last reported sighting was 2 of them at least on a bike. And, that they may have taken themselves into the woods of their own free will. But whatever transpired was something that was unplanned. It wasn't individuals going with murder in mind, whereas in Jamie's case, those 2 boys tried to abduct another boy before Jamie, and they went with an intention. And you could still argue there was la folie à deux, which is the concept. In French, it means the madness of 2, that you always have one who eggs the other on, who's the leader, and that was certainly seen in the Jamie Bulger case. And we saw it equally with the Moors murderers, a male and a female. In fact, Myra Hindley and Ian Brady, and he recently died, but he was the one who was very much in control and in charge. And that la folie à deux is an understood aspect where behavior gets normalized and one encourages the other. However, there tends to be an intention from the outset. And I think, or I believe certainly with what happened to Stevie, Michael, and Christopher, was that something unfolded very rapidly. We know because certain things were not brought to the crime scene. There were things that were made use of in that place in the woods that were not brought to that scene. So it was a quick event and probably, most likely by an individual or individuals that were authority figures to some degree. And the authority figure part is an important part when we think about, how children behave and acquiesce to authority figures, the same way as Jamie, a toddler, sees the two boys as older than him and, has no free choice as a toddler. He can't talk or express himself, but with the three young boys who are 8 years old, they could certainly express themselves, but there was something that kept them in that place, and certainly there were very few defensive wounds on them all.
Right. My question about the 10-year-olds who killed Jamie Bulger, did they have a history of mental illness? Do you know? Did they have any kind of prior behavioral issues or anything that sort of would have tipped somebody off that they were planning this? Or
well, I mean, it's an interesting question, and I believe, thinking back in time, that there were some warning signs of what we would say some scatological issues, particularly with one of them, but no more so for the other, no more so, with one of them than most young boys at that age. But one in particular, yes, there were some markers, but were they markers that said that this boy would go on to kill? That's the question. And of course, young children aren't normally assessed for, behavioural issues, and they both came from the estate up in, I think it was Bootle in Merseyside, and lots of children do come from estates and may be delinquent in the sense of getting involved in petty crime, but that doesn't mean to say they're going to go on to kill.
Can you explain what that means, estates? I don't think that we have the same.
Yeah, so it's kind of assisted housing, government funded and assisted housing. We call them council estates. So they came from a poor, deprived area, but that on its own doesn't feature as a risk marker. But one of them in particular did show signs, in terms of certain indicators that were what we would call scatological. And we see it with a number of children. The earlier you get in to work with them in terms of, mental health psychologists, and far more the likelihood of, getting a positive role model or mentor in, then far more the likelihood is of turning them round. And, children who do come from domestic violence homes, we do know through neuroscience from the age of 0 to 3, there's a propensity to become, in everybody violent and abusive, but there are triggers. And of course, the earlier that you get into work with families affected by domestic violence and abuse, the far better the outcome in terms of them attuning and adjusting and, developing empathy. And, it's much more complicated than just one single trigger. There are protective factors, and there are things that, can act as triggers for individuals. And being in violent and abusive and chaotic situations, some individuals learn that violence and abuse works, and children are like little sponges, so they just reflect back the environment. Children don't do what they're told, they do what they see. They lead by the example of what's being set to them. Yeah. And that's another important, it's quite a complex area, but we do know through neuroscience is that children growing up in violent and abusive homes have smaller brains. And so the cycle can perpetuate, but not in every case. And that's why interventions are so important. The earlier that we see scatological or problematic behaviour, the earlier that professionals are in to work with those children and those families, the far more positive the outcome is likely to be.
When they told me that I was going to spend the rest of my life in prison, at the time I wanted to tell them, look, I don't want to do that. You might as well just go ahead and kill me right now, because I ain't no way I'm gonna spend the rest of my life in prison and miss my family. I just can't do that. But over the years past and everything, I done got used to it, done adjusted to it and everything, how the system works and all that. I adjusted to it.
So we're going to go back into talking about Jessie Misskelley's confession, and there's a lot to talk about this because he has confessed, in inverted commas, several times throughout this case, before the trial and even after the trial. And I think what a lot of our listeners have said on Facebook pages, this is a no-brainer. I mean, if somebody has confessed so many times, you know, they must be guilty. And that sounds terrible. If somebody has confessed, even if then they recant, how can you trust what they say? And, you know, we're going to talk about fortunately, because of Callahan, we can read all of the confessions. And I can't, for me, Laura, I don't know how you feel, I can't even call it a confession. Because to me, a confession is a narrative. It's a beginning, middle, and end story that somebody can tell, you know, over and over again about what they did, what they saw, you know, what happened. And in all of these quote unquote confessions, you know, right after the crime, months after the crime, after he's convicted, they're not narratives. They're not stories. They're just sort of statements or answers to questions, and they change completely all over the place. And, you know, we'll go into the differences. So for me, that's when people say, oh, he confessed, it's like, well, he sort of just answered whatever person was asking him at the time. And so I don't know, what do you have to say about that?
Well, I think they're very important points that you raise. And, you know, it really always depends on the context. I go back to that C word. And you said it. It depends on who's asking the questions, when, how, why, in what kind of circumstances, as in, you know, has it been over a long duration? You know, is that person exhausted? What is it that the person that's asking them the questions, what are they trying to achieve? Are they open-ended questions, or are they very closed questions? And the person on the receiving end of the questions, who are they? And what's their context? So we already know with, let's take Jessie, for example, because that's who we started with. And we talked a bit about what happened. The first account to me is the starting point and the most important one, which we have to remember that he's childlike. He's 17 years of age at the point where he's arrested with an IQ of 72. He's got a low IQ. He's vulnerable. There's suggestibility in terms of how things are phrased. There are inaccuracies that are ignored by those who are asking him the questions. And when he gives the wrong answer to what they want, the interviewer keeps going. And the most important part is that the interviewer gives more information than what Jessie gives. You know, Jessie actually gives nothing new, no new information in the 45 minutes that are recorded. And that's the most striking thing. And you'll remember I said it's not always what's present, it's sometimes what's absent that I'm most interested in. No new information. He's also shown a picture of the dead boy, which again will be very triggering for someone who's vulnerable. What purpose does that serve? That could in and of itself compromise a whole investigation. If you're showing someone something, you know, not just because they are vulnerable, but because you could be giving key information away that's suggestible and now is leading that person. The whole point of an interview and interrogation is to elicit information, to get information and extract it out of that person, not to give more than what you get out. So if you put that on a, you know, in an equation, they're actually, what you're showing is how poor their interrogation skills are. And the fact that when he talks about, Jessie Misskelley talks about rope instead of shoelaces, there are clear details that he gets wrong that are completely ignored, down to even the timing of the murder that is just brushed over. So that first so-called confession, I do have some very serious issues with. Does it stand up in and of itself? Can we be satisfied that that's a true account, that first account? There were so many inaccuracies in it that it's very clear that he also acquiesces to authority.
Yes.
And lots of teenagers, and certainly, you know, we're going back in time now, but young people do and can acquiesce for many reasons when it comes to authority. And everything that I observed about him, and I have to put the caveat that, of course, we're seeing it through the lens of the camera, the documentary, but everything I observed was somebody who acquiesced to authority. And the way that he was on the phone to his father, compliant, acquiescing, wanted to get through a process rather than contributing it, rather than trying to manipulate it was very clear to me. So the other important part to that particular, and I'll put confession in inverted commas, is that we must remember that there is importantly no physical evidence that places him there at that scene, and that the things that he described, there is no physical evidence to support even what he is saying.
Right. Yeah, that's what struck me. And, he may be somebody who does lie and wants to give whoever is asking him the question whatever answer he thinks they need, like an instinct he has. He may not be book smart or bright, but he probably has a survival instinct about when he's being threatened, what he needs to say to get the person who's intimidating him to either back off or to, please them. And why is it important that he says brown rope and not shoelaces? Well, if he really had been there, it's a huge difference. That means he would have had to see Damien and Jason take the laces out of their shoes. And so it's a big difference than saying, oh, well, they were tied with brown rope. That is a significant difference. They didn't take brown rope out of the kids' shoelaces, so the inaccuracies may just seem at first glance to be casual, but that's really different.
It is. And this is some, the nuanced detail of things. That's what you look to understand whether there's veracity, whether someone's telling the truth. Those who don't tell the truth become much more generic and miss key details out about events and things that happened, because the detail is not in their mind's eye, it's just the broad strokes. But we have to remember that, why did people confess? Well, when you understand the research on false confessions, and this is something that people can look up too, is that the Innocence Project shows that 1 in 4 who are wrongfully convicted but are later exonerated by DNA evidence made a false confession. That was startling to me, 1 in 4. And looking at the commonality, well, why is it? There's one commonality as to why all those individuals have made a false confession. And I do think it resonates in this case. And it's the belief that complying with the police will be more beneficial than maintaining their innocence. Now, how does that play out? Well, when we think about reasons why, so, they're saying that eventually someone will agree with what the police are saying or go along with it. Well, there are many reasons for that. But if you break that down further, it's things like that there's duress or coercion or diminished capacity. And I do believe that he, given his IQ and looking and observing the way that he interacts, he has a very simplistic view of life and the way that he talks to people and how he talked to his girlfriend. I saw that and observed it for myself. So it could be mental impairment or through ignorance, or it could be through fear of violence or an actual threat of inflicting harm or a threat of a harsh sentence or misunderstanding a situation.
Well, we're going to have to pause here. Laura has important work to do in London, which includes getting me some chocolate hobnobs. But anyway.
Chocolate hobnobs are always on my list, Lisa, when I come to London. They will definitely be coming back to LA. And, I wanted to also just mention I'm in the thick of organising with the team and some other fantastic people, Paladin's first national conference on stalking and all of our best practice it's our 4th birthday in July. And to mark that, we are highlighting all of our best practice and inviting police from every police force in the UK and our partners and anyone and everyone who works with victims of stalking, including victims, to come to our conference on June the 29th. And it's on our website, so you can have a look at it there. It's going to be at Amnesty International headquarters, and we still have a few places left. It really has sold out, which I'm very pleased about, because we have some fantastic speakers from people like, Clive Ruggles, whose daughter Alice was stalked and murdered. He's going to give a very powerful account of what happened and what needs to change. And Dr. Eleanor Aston and her husband, Kevin. Eleanor was stalked for 8 years, and she's one of our ambassadors, and she's going to talk about that experience. And we're going to hear from her husband for the first time of what it feels like as a family member, and what they feel we need to be doing to change, to better protect victims. And of course, we work together on changing the law to increase the sentences for stalkers, the successful campaign from 5 to 10 years. But then Zoe Dromfield, who you met via Skype, Lisa, Zoe will also be talking at the conference along with Alison Saunders, the head of our Crown Prosecution Service, and Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary, who've been inspecting police forces and the Crown Prosecution Service, and they will be releasing their findings at the end of July. And of course, I'll be giving a presentation with one of my senior independent stalking advocacy caseworkers. We're going to be delivering some workshops around best practice on risk and the lessons from all the homicides, because there have been so many that we really do need to understand those lessons and work together to change. And it's changed at last, actually. That's the important part. And then we've got some great workshops by some leading police experts on good practice, on police investigation, and also on the civil options. We've got an award-winning lawyer and chair of Paladin, Rachel Horman, who I would love to get on the podcast at some point, who is a specialist in domestic violence, forced marriage and stalking, and she'll be delivering a very dynamic workshop on all the civil options that are available, including the new protection orders for stalkers, or from stalkers, I should say.
That's a huge event, Laura. Oh my God. So tell me the date again.
So it is a big event. It is June the 29th, so we are less than 2 weeks out. It's next Thursday, and it's going to be in Shoreditch at the Amnesty International headquarters. You do have to register, so it is an event where you have to register, and we're giving all police forces complimentary passes because we want them to be there, and for some of our partners. And you can look it up on the Paladin website, www.paladinservice.co.uk.
And maybe, Laura, you can post it on our Facebook page too, and if you haven't already.
Well, I can do. I posted it on, I believe, my one, but I would definitely make sure it's on, that you get the link to post it. That would be great.
Wow. Okay. Well, we definitely miss you being here, but I think this was a great solution to try to break this up and, cobble it together with my two colleagues. I'm going to apologize for the sound. I'm recording this in my house, and you could probably hear my children running around at some point, or the lawnmower or something. But, this is what we have, and I'm very grateful that we could, make the time to do this. So thank you, Laura, very much.
Well, thank you, Lisa. You've been organizing behind the scenes to make this work with Paul, so I appreciate, when Jim and I are traveling, it's not always easy, but we are committed to Real Crime Profile, and we love our listeners, and we really want to deliver for you. So please just bear with us when we're on the hoof and we are out at various other locations or globe-trotting, to make events and make things happen. So I'm missing LA for sure, but it's fantastic to be back with my incredible team, the Paladin team, and the board, and the incredible professionals who work over here. So thank you, Lisa and Paul, for making this happen. And I look forward to hearing Jim's voice very soon as well.
Oh, me too. I'll be driving over there shortly to interview him.
I'm sure Jim will have some very docile views on some of the things that we've discussed. And it's a shame to get a chance to debate. Thank you. This is Real Crime Profile signing off.
So if you enjoy our podcast and would like to support us, there are a couple of important things you can do. First, you can go over to iTunes and give us a positive 5-star review. You can check out our sponsors and take advantage of the special promotions for Real Crime Profile listeners. You can go over and like our Facebook page, and you can follow us on Twitter. But most importantly, you can share our podcast with friends, family, and anyone you know would be interested in real crime and the minds that solve those crimes. So thank you for listening.
Real Crime Profile is produced and edited by Paul Francis Sullivan. Sound engineered by Terrell Parham. Music composed by Simba Tsumba. Logo art by Jim Clemente. Real Crime Profile is produced by XG Productions and distributed by Wondery.
For advice and support if you're experiencing stalking in the UK, you can contact Paladin National Stalking Advocacy Service on 0203 866 4107, or you can go on the website www.paladinservice.co.uk. If you're experiencing domestic violence, call the National Domestic Violence Helpline free phone 0800 2000 247. In the US, if you're experiencing domestic abuse and need advice, safety, shelter or counselling, call Genesis, the 24-hour hotline, 214-946-4357, or go on their website, www.genesisshelter.org, or the Domestic Violence Hotline on 800-799-7233.